Hello. In episode 27.2 of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Bryan Cantley, Professor of Design Theory at Cal State Fullerton and founder of Form ULA, or Formula, an experimental architecture design and graphic communication studio based in Southern California. We speak about his new book, Speculative Coolness, Architecture, Media, the Real and the Virtual, published by Routledge earlier this month.
Well, in a typical studio, you might draw something and with the hopes that it gets built. A lot of the work that I do, it's not a search for the buildable, it's a search for spatiality and conditions of visual inquiries that could potentially influence others when they're making things to get built. But its goal is not necessarily to get produced in another medium, in another scale by another person. I think the work, the models certainly, but the drawings too, are themselves are acts of architecture, right? They are the architecture.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Bryan Cantley. Bryan, would you introduce yourself, please?
Certainly, yeah. I'm an architect and designer and educator. I live in Southern California, teach design at California State University, Fullerton. I've been teaching here for, I think this is my 31st year, and been doing experimental and speculative work with my studio Formula probably for just about as long, almost 30 years.
Fantastic. So we're talking. I actually found your Instagram feed before I found your book, and it was through your Instagram feed that I came across your recent book, Speculative Coolness, Architecture, Media, the Real and the Virtual, which I think is an amazing, mind-bending book. Very much out of my normal comfort zone, which is kind of why I went for it, because I kind of want to meet people who are challenging norms within architectural production, practice, design, and education. But where did you train? You call yourself an architect, but you've been doing this project, this type of work for 30 years?
Yeah, exactly. So I did my my undergraduate at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and then moved to Los Angeles in 1987, 88 to do my graduate work at UCLA, and have stuck around ever since. But I've been doing, it started out sort of as a continuation of my thesis project, hadn't come to a conclusion, as it were, when my formal education was over, and the experimental work has just kind of evolved. It's something that I've been focusing on as much, if not more, of as my teaching for the last 30 years. So yeah, it's been kind of it's a 30-year long project per se.
So North Carolina, that was where Henry Sanoff was professor, participatory design, is that right? Or what was the kind of, because obviously when one thinks of UCLA, one has these ideas of kind of, well, Los Angeles really, but
right.
What drew you away from, I'm guessing, a more parochial school into, the big bad?
Sure. Well, not a tremendous amount of diverse culture. I grew up in a farming community, Oxford, North Carolina. Probably a couple thousand people proper in the town. Great people, great place to be around. My father was a textile worker, so between the visiting his plant and getting inside these large machines and seeing the farming equipment and the construction equipment, I kind of have a birthright affinity for large architectural scale machines, and especially machines that make other machines or machines that construct. Finished my undergraduate education. I had visited had family in California, visited out here, and very much like the culture. And have to say the weather certainly wasn't a negative. But I discovered that LA was it was more of a laboratory, especially in the late 80s. It was more of an experimental place. And I found that the kind of architecture that I at least thought I wanted to pursue had a finite conclusion in North Carolina, and LA seemed to be more of a place to try things out and experiment and get a sounding board from other architects and society, and it just kind of stuck.
So that's really interesting. I think that's really interesting that you mentioned farm machines, but we haven't really described your work. I mean, it's architecture as drawing. Is that a way of putting it? How would you describe your work? Like, what is its mode? And I suppose how would you describe it? Like, difficult for a creator to describe their own things, and your drawing's particularly difficult to describe.
That's probably one of the more challenging questions I've ever received. To try to boil it down, so it definitely is looking at the machine and technology and media as vehicles for expression and exploration. The act and the search of drawing as part of the practice is obviously quite integral and critical. Given the nature of the vast majority, maybe perhaps all of the work is more about asking questions and providing answers. Drawing, for me, is the way of starting to engage that. I've got a saying that I've been kind of playing around with for 20 years, is that drawings lie, or at least they tell us the untruths that we want to hear. When I'm working on a digital model, or I do a lot of physical models, there's kind of a finite response, built in, and we can sort of blur representation ideals and components within the models. But when you get into the drawing, there's so many opportunities to not commit, not to define, but try to unpack and kind of reconstruct and reformulate. It's always been a huge part, and the sort of the typical notion, the way that I was trained, where one would sketch and draw, diagram, sketch, and then build models, is kind of to see a physical conclusion to represent the building. With my practice, it's not linear. There's this extreme oscillation between the two-dimensional, the 2.5-dimensional, and the 3-dimensional. It's oftentimes the model is in reinforming and deforming a drawing exercise as much as the drawing would be the model. So it's kind of been this kind of back and forth, trying to see. I used to call it media shifting. That when we get to a certain point in a project or a proposal or an inquiry, where at that moment the media doesn't yield anything new, it's time for me to switch to a different media, whether it's modeling, whether it's limited access to animation or writing or whatever, until that then stops producing a larger set of questions, and then I'll shift back to a different media. So it's kind of, but that's a really long, of almost avoiding answer, excuse me, to that question. But it's really difficult to kind of try to pinpoint the nature of the work, other than looking at the potential kinetics of architecture, which I can obviously explore through the metaphor of the machine, but also through drawing, because I never deal with a static condition in drawing. When I'm constructing the drawings, when I'm writing about the drawings, when I'm thinking about how they operate, they're never considered to be static. They're frozen moments in time, but I almost consider them to be sentient beings, where they're kind of moving and they become their own midwives. They're recreating themselves, they're recreating other things, they're kind of reaching back and forth in time. They're multi-chronological events. It's kind of all over the place, as probably most of the drawings read.
Yeah, they do, but they are also, so it's a sort of resistance to a object fixated practice, rather
Absolutely.
looking at architecture as an unfolding emergent property of processes and materials.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that may have had something to do with, growing up around architectural scale machines. or machines that were, creating houses and housing developments, or other machines. This idea that they're propagation tools. They're not just tools to do a task, but they're tools that are used in the creation of other synthetic realities or constructs.
That's a really fascinating idea. It's a really, really interesting idea. I mean, to what extent was your work already pointing in this direction when you went to LA, or is this work in some way a very urban response, a response to kind of the conditions that you encountered in LA in the 80s and 90s, where you've got this, I mean, remarkable city, this remarkable animal in a way. It's like an ecology in its own right.
Absolutely. I was not, when I was in North Carolina, I had not put together the concept of machine and architecture. They were segregated entities. And LA being the laboratory, being so driven by the freeway and the automobile and the machines that sort of the machines and the mechanical synthetic tissue that connects pockets of space where we conducted our lives. It wasn't until I got out here and started observing and living within this kind of stretched out, elongated mechanical environment that I started really looking at the machine as a language for architecture. I don't know if in North Carolina I hadn't been told by my professors that the two couldn't merge, because I don't think I had made that hypothesis yet. But when I got out here, I certainly had some supportive professors. Doug McLeod, who was working at Barton Meyer's office, was a key instigator. I think he was at the Banff Center the last time I checked, but helped me sort of understand the relationship between the mechanical landscape that I was experiencing in Los Angeles and where the work was trying to go. But I hadn't been permitted to go through that doorway. In fact, I probably hadn't been shown the doorway. And Doug was really critical in that aspect. It's 100% a response to, and I think you put it very well, the animal that especially in the 80s was Los Angeles. I mean, it's changed quite a bit since then, but the reliance on the mechanical tissue that connected all parts of life. I mean, the city was under substantial growth at that time. We've always joked that the freeways are never not under construction. I mean, they're constantly, breathing and becoming larger and larger and consuming more of the landscape and putting more of our mobile processes on them. So it becomes, there's a constant relationship with the automobile and the freeway and how it's really changing and defining the fluctuating fabric that I consider Los Angeles to be.
I remember watching some kind of comedy show, and it was talking, and I think this is Raina Banham as well, isn't it? Looking at the idea of the freeway specifically as a sort of man-human synthesis, but the idea that it's also public space. And we've kind of, like, until we recognize that about cities like Los Angeles, and we have nothing equivalent in Britain, really. Birmingham has a bit of a spaghetti junction, but it's also awful. Whereas, no, that's probably rude, and any listeners in Birmingham apologize, but it is awful. It's we got a spaghetti junction there, which I think we're quietly proud of, and then horrified by at the same time. But there's this idea that the roadways themselves, like, there's this comedy show, and people were listening to the breakfast show, and it's like a hip hop show. I can't remember. It's like listened to by like 8 million people or something like that, some staggering number. And actually they're listening whilst they're sitting in their cars.
Sure.
And so the cars, even though you're isolated, individuated in your car, you're actually part of a collective, which is the people listening to that show in cars on the highway. And as such, it's a form of public space. As legitimate as any piazza in Italy.
Sure. Yeah. And the idea that we're creating these enclaves and these public spaces and these communities through media and through technology is something that's always obviously fascinated me. And I think the work is reflecting that to a certain extent.
So the title of the book, Speculative Coolness, can we can we, like, what do you mean by cool? I know what the speculation is, but what do we mean by cool here?
Well, I mean, part of it originally was an homage to the hot and cold media, and looking at media that requires a higher level of intellectual and physical engagement. So I think most of the work, it's actually a term, I didn't coin the term. Sarah Lorenzen, who was at the time the chair of architecture at Cal Poly Pomona, labeled my work that once, I think, when I was doing a lecture there, and it kind of stuck because of the reference to coolness and the fact that the architectures, if I may call them that, and the drawings require demand that the readers, the viewers, the occupants become an active participant. And so it was really for me, I'm not sure what Sarah meant by it, but the coolness initially was the idea of the level of interaction and the requirement of interaction with the transmission, which in most cases were drawings for me. The coolness factor, I'll leave that up. I'll leave that up to the reader. I would like to think that the work has a slang coolness, and the fact that it's hoping to be different than mainstream and innovative, and providing sort of kind of a head scratcher or a head turn. But again, that's not something I could. That's like trying to say the work is beautiful. I mean, it's certainly going to be in the eye of beholder. And I've joked, maybe myself, my wife, and my mom want to have one of my drawings hanging behind their couch. So I'm not going to superimpose my levels of coolness or beauty on anybody else. I'll leave that up for the reader to.
I think I was wondering about it because I was having a conversation with a scholar called Gevork Hartunian about this idea of cool, and we were talking about the urban spectacle and the way that the cool has become a kind of almost it's become more than just this, like, it's cool kind of thing. It's something to do with the deportment. It's almost like, the birth of cool. And we're in that position. Your work sits within that kind of trajectory. It's like something, which is quite a praise, by the way. It's something to do with the idea of, I wondered whether this word cool was something to do with this idea around a certain urban pose that is at once kind of obviously spectacular, but also trying to downplay its own spectacularness. It's sort of that kind of.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started playing around with this idea 7 or 8 years ago, and was looking at the title, I really started, I was fascinated by the term coolness because of its ability to both, as you mentioned, it has the ability of sort of announcing its specialness, for lack of a better term, but it also, in the context of the word, at least the way that we use it in the States, and maybe particularly in California, the phrase "it's cool" also represents sort of a acknowledgement and a downplaying, and saying that it's part of the norm. It's not something that has to provide friction.
Mm-hmm.
So what I like about it is it has this ability to sort of do both. It causes a friction regarded in terms of maybe aesthetic value or uniqueness to the discipline. But when someone approaches you with a problem, hey, I'm sorry that this happened, and you say, yeah, it's cool, it immediately puts it back into an even level playing field where it can be accepted by those other than those that might be interested in just when it's a spectacular condition. So for me, I really appreciated and was intrigued by the fact that I could occupy both of these worlds simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that the work and the drawings try to do, is that they're attempting to straddle different types of areas within the discipline and within other visual disciplines, and trying to make a I don't know if plea is the right word, but trying to make a statement that this kind of thing is. I have this conversation with my architecture friends a lot. They look at my work, and those of them that are in practice, that are doing actual buildings, that are running successful firms, that are managing 20, 30 people, look at my work and say it's not architecture. And so part of it is an attempt at saying, it's okay, it's cool. We're looking at architecture as a discipline, and the profession is a component of the discipline, but it's not the only part of the discipline. So in that sense, it becomes kind of an educational tool, not just for students, but hopefully for the profession as well, to start expanding the definition of architecture. I find that the profession and the AIA here, its main goal is to constantly shave down the definition of what architecture is and can be, or who even can call themselves an architect. And I'm much more interested in thickening that surface and thickening that kind of dialogue and those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I like this question. It's one that I try and get my students to think about. I run a little theory course here, and this idea around where architecture happens, like what constitutes architecture, is kind of critical to the identity of the architect. And as most of our graduates don't actually go on to become architects in the full kind of prescribed legally, AIA, in our case, it's the RIBA and ARB, but they don't go on. And I ask them, is architecture the thing on the drawing board, or is it the buildings? Because we don't actually make buildings. Builders make buildings. What we do is we draw pictures of buildings and sell them for money. And so there is, and which is kind of extremely depressing, but I can be a depressing tutor.
I'm still trying to wrap my head about sell them for money concept, but that's a different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the goal. That's the dream. So I think that's a really interesting question. That was one of the things that I put to you, this idea of an architecture that is drawing, this idea of architecture is always fundamentally conceptual. What gets built is something in a way that's a little bit different.
I think that's been a conversation and a debate that's been around with me since I've been in school, and I would agree. I've always looked at it. Architects create the designs, the suggestions for, which happen to be made through models and drawings, and contractors, builders, are the ones that manifest it. When I first started teaching at Cal State Fullerton, I'm within a department of visual arts, and I was the only architect teaching architecture here. And I used to have, when I was preparing my tenure document, I was having debates with the chair that I was trying to explain to them that architecture, at least in our department, I was the only artist that didn't get to make life-size manifest my designs. Everybody else, a painter was not hiring someone to do their paintings, a sculptor was not hired someone to do their sculptures, but as an architect, if I were to draw something, I would hire, or someone would be hired to make it, and I would have, because I don't have any building skills, little to no involvement in the making of it. And so the criticality of my work was not based on whether it was built, but what the propositions were for, and how the propositions then were folded into either academia or professional conversation about design. So that's been with me from the beginning. I think it's interesting too, because I think the way that I like the way that you phrased it, that architecture, some of it gets, all of it is drawn, some of it gets built. But there's also kind of, I think with my work is that, in a typical studio, you might draw something and with the hopes that it gets built. A lot of the work that I do, it's not even about becoming built. It's not a search for the buildable. It's a search for spatiality and conditions of visual inquiries that could potentially influence others when they're making things to get built. But its goal is not necessarily to get produced in another medium, in another scale by another person. I think the work, and I might be in a minority here, that I think the work, the models certainly, but the drawings too, are themselves are acts of architecture, right? They are the architecture. So but again, I've been beating my head against the wall for decades, having that conversation with both people, sadly in the profession as well as outside the profession.
Yeah, and it must be coming. I mean, because this idea of there's a lot to talk about. But who have been your major influences? I mean, on a certain level, when I see your work, when your work is there's a strong influence, as I read it, of sci-fi within it, science fiction films, but also science fiction graphic magazines from years gone by. Is that fair? Is it sci-fi influenced? And who else? I mean, has Lebbeus Woods, for example, his kind of work, that kind of work been?
Sure. 100% sci-fi. Been a huge fan of the genre as long as I can remember. Neuromancer's, my favorite book. So I think it kind of that fills a lot of gaps. Architecturally, I don't hide it as probably well as I could, but my work are constant series of homages to my influences, and there's quite a few of them. I'm going to miss them, but Lebbeus, obviously, Tom Main, who interestingly enough, I've gotten to know through my work and has become a really good friend and an amazing supporter. Helped convince me, was one of the people that talked me into doing the book, and so that's been phenomenal, especially the way his early drawings, and we've had some amazing conversations. Wes Jones and Neil Denari, obviously, and that's probably what I don't hide so well. I'm constantly getting people saying, "Oh, it looks like Wes's work or Neil's work," and hopefully not an insult to them. Wes has become a really good friend through the work as well. Wes wrote an essay for my first book. He's written an essay for Speculative Coolness. Zaha, Peter Eisenman, Libeskind, anybody that was doing highly experimental theoretical work that was trying to take the conversation into a larger area and not kind of strip it down. And I think,
sorry.
No, go please.
No, I was just thinking this idea of because you mentioned this word criticality, and I'd written it down already, thinking about this idea of a critical drawing practice, which obviously when you look at early Zaha work and early Eisenman work, and that's critical, that's central to their work. What are they criticizing? What is the condition that you're contesting that so needs it? Like what is the problematic that the work is trying to discern an answer or answers to?
I think specifically over the last 7 to 10 years, it's looking at, or it's attempting to look at and make propositions concerning the technology of media and the media of technology, and how that, just like we were talking about the radio broadcast and where it sort of has the ability to encompass and form a group. So I really am intrigued by these dualities where we have events or situations or systems that can both unify and segregate at the same time, sort of like we were talking about with the word coolness. It kind of has a way of getting opposite ends of the spectrum. So I have been through, I guess I'm an interesting age. I'll be 58 in August. And so I was raised in a time where, the iPhone and the ubiquity of information, I sort of got in on that, but wasn't quite young enough to have it. I was old enough to have a pre-media technology history, and I'm kind of in that very interesting generation where we're caught in the middle. My kids are all raised on technology. My students are everybody's sort of literally connected and disconnected at the same time with the technology. So I'm very interested in propositions, visual and spatial propositions that look at, that challenge, that utilize and question the role of media and technology, as well as the role of or our ability or inability to accept presented media as conditions of truth. I find that incredibly troubling, but also incredibly potentially hopeful, depending on who's kind of got hold of the steering wheel at any given time. And so I think the work is trying to use that idea of how media could be positively used, how it is negatively used, how it can produce a lemming effect, how it can immediately segregate socio-political boundaries and conditions almost blindly, with a blind faith, so that can be folded into architectural propositions and inquiries, where I guess at the end of the day, what I'd like for people who are attempting to read the work would be to sort of step back and scratch their head and ask a question, not about the architectural response, but about the nature of how media and technology could be used and how they are being used, or in this case, abused as we've seen currently. That's fairly new. That's, again, 7 or 10 years. Before that, it was looking at the condition of static architecture, not as a formal issue, but as a condition of I've always had this theory that we as ergonomic, organic, evolving, decaying entities, and the relationship to our built society and our built environment, which doesn't really reflect that, right? Everything's hard and fast, and the decay is not built in kind of within an organic system. That was one of the things that interested me with the machine, was looking at the ability of, instead of our bodies just adapting to the architecture as that an architectural condition could adapt to our configuration, the kinetics, the reconfigurations, the lack of statics within architecture, or even within architectural drawing. So if I'm successful, and I'm not sure that I am, I'd like to take the idea of being critical of that, repurposing the role of adaptability with architecture and humanity, and the new idea of media, technology, media, and trying to kind of fold it into one. Recently, and this is not in the book, I've really started to looking at with some of the collage works. I'm going back and redrawing on top of existing building drawings, somewhat well-known building drawings. We're in a condition right now, and this has everything to do with media and technology, of becoming awakened as a society for incredible history of what I like to call synthetic fabricated histories. And so my thought was, and it's just the seed of an idea, that if we're in all other aspects of our life, if we're questioning our histories and we're questioning the narratives that have been constructed, the architectural drawing needs to be reinvestigated right as well. So I've started to draw these constructs, these installations, these devices and architectures that map and redraw, and they're meant to question the standards of architectural representation that has built the way that we have approached architectural education and architectural building, over the last, numerous amounts of decades. So again, that's a new concept, but it's based on the idea of media and technology, and the way that media and technology have contributed to these synthetic histories, and these fabrications of what we've taken to be a truth to a certain point, and now we're kind of reinvestigating them. I mean, architecture, I'll leave it to those who are more experienced and have something more important to say, as to look at how the built environment does that, and how the education is doing that. I'm really interested in looking right now at classic accepted buildings and drawings of buildings, where if we can challenge those, my feeling would be that we can go back and then we can start challenging the constructs that formed them. And maybe we're at a place in architecture and society where we, through this awakening, and that's probably not the right term, but through this awareness of such synthetics, start to question how we might redefine from here on out how truthful we are in our narratives. That's a really long.
I think that makes that. I mean, all three of those kind of things are really. It's really interesting. There's a sort of technology as a mechanism for vernacularizing, and this drawing technique, which, as you described at the beginning, is a sort of iterative process between the model and the drawing and the site and the model and the drawing, and back and forth. In a way, is about, as I understood it and reading the book, and I want to come on to this idea of reading it, because you mentioned people reading your book, but the writing of the book itself is also speculative. And I think that that's worthy of, that's quite an interesting idea, that you can also deconstruct or reformulate the way that we talk about architecture to enable it to be more, to do a new thing, to move away from the kind of normative way that things are being done, which I'm guessing the fundamental critique is that they're not doing them very well. They're not, the tools that we use to produce contemporary architecture are not that useful if the goal is rewarding, equitable, peaceful, joyful, creative society.
Sure. Right.
And so these techniques that you seem to be describing, and the way that you then describe them in the texts in Speculative Coolness, seem to me to be, in a way, sort of like breaking away from this kind of hegemonic, this is how we do architecture. This is the only way we do architecture, and because we say so, and we're up here and you're down there.
Right, right.
So the plan and elevation are very fascinating drawings, but they are not the only way to communicate. Like vernacular settlements in which 2 billion people live don't use plan and elevation drawings.
Right, right.
And the other thing, that this idea of mobility that you talk about in all of the lovely, lovely presentations, this idea of creating an architecture that is astatic, again, not actually something that's outside informal settlements, probably historical human experiences. Got this peculiar idea about stasis and stability now, which I think, your work seems to be challenging.
Hopefully, and at the end of the day, I don't know if I'm proposing anything new or radical. I'm proposing my take on how this could be kind of thought about, and then hopefully with the construction of the book, disseminated. And I want to, I need to mention my editor Peter Baldwin and the graphic designer Mark Stanley. I mean, this was a joint effort into trying to think of a deliverable system that would not be the normative way that any of us have talked about it before. Not to say that it's a breakthrough and it's amazing or anything like that. It's just an individual take on it that we haven't necessarily seen before, and we wanted to make sure that the way that the text was broken down, the way that the work was curated from Peter's aspect, the way that the work was graphically disseminated through Mark's aspect, was all trying to play off of and harmonize with the flavor or the essence of what the work was trying to do, which has become not so much a refined single target, but kind of a blur, constantly moving, to allow hopefully more levels of engagement, and to not say that there's only 5 places where someone can enter the conversation, but maybe there's 500, and there's, you can come in at your own level and pull out and come back in at a different place. So I think the way that we thought about the structure of the book, and even the physical, with time and budget constraints, obviously, never get what we want to do with the book, but we did. I think a pretty good job. In fact, just last night I got the full book as a set of cut sheets from the printer. So I haven't seen it as an entity. It's not bound, but to see it as a physical entity. Again, the where you put your fingers, how you're flipping through it, the sequence of the pages, what the images look like. I think it's hopefully once we get the final product, it's going to be, for students and hopefully for some professionals, a way of kind of maybe stepping to the side just slightly and looking at some of the conversations that we're having in a slightly different way. I mean, if it does that and nothing more, I would consider it to be successful. I don't know if I would call it radical. I don't know if I would call it life changing. I mean, that would be awesome if we could assign those values to it. But the objective of the work has always been to get people to look at it, to look at these conversations in a slightly different way than they hadn't before.
It would be a great pull quote to have on the back, though, wouldn't it? Life changing.
Yeah,
that would be great. That would put
in a good way.
Yeah. Maybe your book would move out of the architectural section of the library and into the self-help.
Or the self deconstruction. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think there is something kind of. I think it's going to. I mean, I think it will be an important book when it comes out because of this sort of the deconstructivist moment was very short-lived, and then they became spectacle makers, and they all got kind of swallowed by the machine.
Right.
And they're really rich now, so they had a great time. If they're still with us, but there is something I think really interesting about this moment. We were touching on this briefly just before we started recording, which is this specific condition of the post-COVID world, which as educators, you and I have. It's complicated. Something has changed. And perhaps what this book and the work that you present in it is an opportunity to start like I've been thinking like we need to stop doing lectures. Like they're not really the kind of way people consume information anymore.
Right.
And is it like essays? I've always found them a bit problematic because I was never much good at writing them, to be honest. Can't concentrate that long.
Sure.
So maybe, and perhaps what this is that there is in Speculative Coolness in your work the seeds of a new way of conceptualizing an architecture fit for this condition that we find ourselves in, that takes that deconstructivist story, re-energizes it with a mobility, and disinfects it of its kind of its role in neoliberal capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully, I mean, I think the work and the book there, and the drawing in general, but the drawings that I do, I intend them to be tools. Not with a prescriptive value for how they're going to be used, but it's a different tool that if it's and I have this conversation with my students all the time. I use the great reference of the hammer. A hammer is only going to be effective if it's picked up and it's utilized, not necessarily as a hammer, not in the Heideggerian sense where we're only aware of the nail that it's driving and then the tool gets out of the way, but it has to have a functionality. If you hold it backwards or you hold it with a different part of your body, it still can function as a tool. And then the tool actually becomes part of the conversation. So I'm not interested so much in tools that become invisible. I'm interested in the equipment that comes to the forefront and becomes part of the conversation about how it might be used differently. And in that case, to further the analogy, what new we might construct with a tool that's used in ways that we hadn't thought about before. And hopefully the book will continue that or allow that conversation possibly with students.
Yeah, for sure. Because there is, I mean, you talk about the work in I suppose listeners might be tempted to think that the work is very, very remote and abstract, but it's not. It's still architectural. You can still see architecture there. The Project C SUF Sentinel, that looks almost buildable.
That was a perhaps
a bit more buildable than Alice 2.0.
Yeah, a little less expensive to build. Yeah,
but that it is still observably architecture. It's not like it's still something that is almost, with a bit of value engineering, you could imagine being built.
Yeah, even the DC-19. That was actually done completely during COVID. That was a re-examination of the condition of domesticity based on pre-vaccination or pre-vaccination ability COVID, right? When we were still in lockdown, we were still isolated at that point. I had a theory. I mean, this thing could have gone on for 10 years if we hadn't, if vaccinations, I don't want to make it political. I believe in them. I am vaccinated. I think that it's going to help prolong our lives, but that was a condition when the virus was still brand new and everything was locked down and life as we knew it had ceased to exist. So I was taking the opportunity of redefining what a domestic condition would be based on, at that point, it was maximum amounts of sunlight exposure and ventilation. We knew we had to change the paradigm of enclosed space versus open space. The front courtyard, the Amazon delivery port became, for many people, our only way of engaging with the public. And so that was a major design feature. Very short-lived project, but it was trying to capture a moment in time that was responding to a specific condition. Buildable, yeah, expensive, yes, way too expensive, yes, but buildable in terms of that it starts to redefine issues about domesticity that will, as you said, now that things have changed and certain parts of our lives will always be changed as a result of this, regardless of whether the COVID is out there or not out there anymore, whether we ever find a cure for it. Our physical landscape and our social and certainly in the States, our political landscape will forever be changed because of this phenomenon. So it was an opportunity of looking at, the technology of food delivery and the technology of medicine delivery and the technology of ventilation and the technology of the political machine that really segregated things here in the States. We unfortunately did a horrible job. We took a human condition, a medical condition, and we politicized it, and then we weaponized it because of that. And we did. I mean, I think it was done poorly all over the world, but I think we were the amplifier of that, unfortunately. And so it was an opportunity of taking all of those kind of floating parts and doing a project that was not about being buildable, but that used an architectural language that people might be able to understand. Okay, that looks and behaves like a building, maybe not what we think a house would be, but it was not so fantastical that it stayed out kind of on the parameters. It was meant to come back and start talking about I had conversations with a lot of my non-architecture friends about that project because we were talking about the condition that I can't talk to you unless you're standing at the end of my driveway. We used to have parties in my old neighborhood where everybody would bring their chairs and we would stay 50 feet apart. And we were redefining new social fabrics within the domestic condition based on this kind of this entity that no one could see or touch. And so I found it to be fascinating, and it seemed to be worthy of an architectural proposal, I guess, for lack of a better terms.
Yeah, for sure. How do you go about teaching something like this? Like, how do you take this model of, because obviously for a teacher, drawing is an analytical and discursive tool as well as it is a representational tool. And your drawings are doing both things simultaneously, which I think is quite an interesting characteristic of them, that they are, there's this word palimpsest that you use as well. This idea of an erasure, but a memory or a trace. So your drawings are both the working out and the presentation of the thing all at the same time as I read them.
Sure.
Rather than that thing that we do in sketchbooks and then we get out the A1 sheet of paper and we carefully clean our, line it out, or we print out these days. We draw on a sketchbook for like 2 minutes, and then we draw up in SketchUp for like 2 hours. And then we make it look cool, and then we walk away. So there's a kind of much more kind of, it's an interesting technique. So I was wondering, how do you use this as a technique in your teaching, and what are your experiences of it for students?
So if I were to try to teach this specifically, which I don't, but I would actually invert the process. As a methodology, I would start in any media that allowed me to expand a level of inquiry, and then I talked about shift to another media. So I often, when I'm working, will spend a lot of time on my big drawing board or in a model phase, and then I'll go back into my sketchbook and develop that through text and through diagramming. So it's not the typical sketchbook then. I look at the work, and when I try to talk to students about this specifically, as I mentioned, it's more about being a tool, a tool that presents itself. It's sort of like the this will really put me in the geek category, but it's the sword of Gryffindor, right? So the tool presents itself when it's needed, and it allows you to do what is needed to do at that time, and then it might vanish, and then it might come back again in another aspect. So the thing that I have talked about with students is that you have to avoid compartmentalizing. I only do this kind of thinking with this kind of media, and then when I go to a different media, I only do this kind of thinking. That tends to collapse in on itself, and it doesn't allow for hybridization. So I deal, when I deal with students with this, we talk about the hybridization, the crossover, thinking of things that you can only do in drawing form, but to do that in a modeling format, or think of things, the spatialization, the techniques, things that you can only think about doing a three-dimensional model, but doing that in a drawing, so that you're not stereotyping, you're not limiting, you're not getting into the naming problem with even the media typologies and what that has typically allowed us or prevented us to do. That would kind of be the core of it.
Sounds fascinating. Sounds really, really wonderful. I think we'll leave it there, but thank you so much, Bryan. I've really enjoyed trying to understand a little bit more about your work.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I hope I tend to talk and I tend to go off on tangents quite a bit, much like the work. They're hard to focus. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for finding the work of interest enough to talk about it. It's an honor, and I really appreciate it.
Nice. Thanks to Bryan for joining me on this episode, and for reintroducing me to that wonderful world of, well, speculative coolness. Thanks Fran at Routledge for the PDF of the book too. You can buy a real version via the links in the podcast description, where you'll also find info on Bryan and as many of his online avatars as I could dig up. Please subscribe to the podcast and share this episode liberally, and thanks for listening. Cheers.